Chris had always dreamed of traveling. It was the one thing he looked forward to the most in his life. After saving up for months, he finally booked a trip to Europe, a place rich with history, culture, and breathtaking landscapes. One of the cities he was most excited to visit was the capital of a country with a long-standing royal heritage. He had seen photos of the palaces, the grand squares, and, of course, the royal guards standing perfectly still in front of important landmarks. It all seemed like something straight out of a movie. And now, he was going to experience it for himself. The morning he arrived in the city, the weather was perfect. Clear skies, a light breeze, and the sun shining brightly. He couldn't have asked for a better day to explore. With his backpack slung over his shoulder and a camera in hand, Chris set out to take in as much as he could. He wandered through cobblestone streets, snapping pictures of the old buildings, the bustling markets, and the lively cafes where people sat outside sipping coffee. Everything felt so vibrant and full of life. Chris' friends were with him, and together they made their way toward the royal palace, the heart of the city. It was a massive building with tall gates, grand columns, and statues lining the entrance. Tourists were everywhere, taking photos and admiring the stunning architecture. Chris couldn't help but feel a bit excited himself. He had always read about royal families in books and seen them in movies, but being so close to one in real life felt surreal. As they walked closer to the palace, they noticed the royal guards standing motionless in their uniforms, each holding a rifle. They looked as if they were part of the building itself, blending seamlessly with the grand architecture. They were imposing, serious, and completely unmoving. It was almost like they weren't real people, just statues that happened to blink now and then. Chris, being the playful type, started joking with his friends about how these guards never seemed to smile, no matter how many tourists took pictures of them or waved at them. "I bet they get tired of standing there all day without even blinking," Chris said with a grin. His friends laughed, agreeing that it must be the most boring job in the world. That's when Chris had an idea. What if he could break the serious facade of the guard? It would be hilarious, right? A perfect prank. He would throw something at the guard, just to see if they would react. It was all in good fun, or so Chris thought. He glanced around and spotted a small cafe nearby. He could see that the people were enjoying hot drinks and pastries, and the idea hit him. He would buy a coffee, walk up to the guard, and throw it in his face. He imagined the shocked reaction, the laughter that would follow, and the story they would tell back home. Chris' friends were hesitant at first, but after a few more jokes, they reluctantly agreed. "It's just a harmless prank," they said. And so, with excitement building inside him, Chris made his way toward the cafe, his mind already racing with thoughts of how funny this would be. He could already see himself telling the story to his family and friends once he got back. Little did he know, this innocent idea would soon take an unexpected turn. Chris couldn't shake the idea from his mind. The more he thought about it, the funnier it seemed. As he and his friends walked towards the cafe, Chris couldn't help but laugh quietly to himself. He could already picture the look on the guard's face when the hot coffee splashed onto him. It would break the serious, almost robotic nature of the guard, and maybe even get a smile out of him. Chris was convinced it was going to be the perfect prank. The small cafe was cozy, with warm lighting and a few tables near the window where people sat enjoying their drinks. Chris approached the counter and ordered a large coffee, his hands trembling slightly with excitement. The barista handed him the steaming cup, and Chris took it with a grin. As he held the cup, the warmth radiated through his hands, and the delicious aroma made him feel more confident in his plan. It wasn't just a cup of coffee, it was the key to his prank. His friends were still unsure. They glanced at each other, the hesitation clear on their faces, but they also couldn't deny that the idea sounded like it might be fun. It wasn't like Chris was going to hurt anyone, right? It was just coffee, and everyone knew that royal guards had a reputation for being unmoving and serious. Surely, a little joke wouldn't hurt. They laughed nervously, unsure if they were making the right choice, but still intrigued by the idea of pulling off something daring. Chris took a deep breath and began walking back toward the royal guards. The closer he got, the more his excitement grew. He tried to act cool, but there was a buzzing feeling in his stomach. He wasn't sure if it was nerves or adrenaline, but it felt like the start of something big. His friends trailed behind him, still uncertain but curious to see how it would unfold. As they reached the spot where the guards stood, Chris noticed that they remained as still as statues. Not a single movement. The guard in front of them had a strong posture, and his face was set in a stern expression. It almost looked like he wasn't even alive, like part of the scenery. Chris' heart raced as he realized that there would be no turning back now. He took a final glance at his friends, who gave him hesitant nods, silently encouraging him to go through with it. He moved slowly, making sure the guard wouldn't notice his approach. The sound of his footsteps on the cobblestone was drowned out by the bustling crowd around them. No one seemed to notice Chris as he carefully closed the distance between himself and the guard. His fingers tightened around the coffee cup, and for a split second, he considered backing out. But then the thought of the guard's reaction pushed him forward. This was going to be hilarious. He stood directly in front of the guard now, just a few feet away. The royal guard still didn't move. Chris took a deep breath, and with a quick, determined motion, he lifted the cup of hot coffee and aimed it at the guard. He had no idea what to expect. He just wanted to see the guard flinch or at least break character. The moment felt surreal, as though it were happening in slow motion. The coffee was on its way, and there was no turning back now. As Chris threw the coffee, his heart pounded in his chest, and he couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. He watched as the steaming liquid flew through the air, imagining it landing on the guard's face and finally breaking his perfect stillness. Chris could already hear the laughter from his friends, and in his mind, he saw himself becoming the hero of the group for pulling off the ultimate prank. But as the coffee came closer to its target, something unexpected happened. The guard didn't even flinch, not a single movement. The liquid splashed against the guard's uniform, but the man didn't react at all. Not even a blink. He was as still as ever, his face showing no sign of surprise or anger. Chris stood there for a moment, his hands still in midair, watching in disbelief. He had expected at least some reaction, but the guard didn't seem to notice at all. The coffee, now spilled across the guard's pristine uniform, slowly dripped down in a few places, but the guard remained unmoving, like a statue. The crowd around them had noticed the splash and paused for a second, some people murmuring and taking quick photos, but no one seemed to make a scene. It was almost as if the guard was completely unaffected, as if the coffee had never even touched him. Chris blinked, confused. He had expected something dramatic, a reaction that would turn the prank into a funny story. But all he got was a guard who stood there, not moving an inch. For a moment, Chris thought about apologizing or even laughing it off, but the realization of what he had done began to sink in. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. The quiet that followed felt heavy. Chris had hoped for some sort of confrontation, but the lack of a response was making the whole situation feel awkward. His friends were staring wide-eyed, unsure of what to do. They hadn't expected the guard to ignore it completely, and now they were worried. Chris looked at them, his face turning red with embarrassment. He thought maybe the guard was trained to not react to anything, no matter what happened, but that didn't make it feel any less strange. He had expected a burst of laughter from the crowd, or at least a shocked reaction from the guard, but it seemed like everyone was more focused on the quiet spectacle in front of them. As Chris stood frozen in place, waiting for the situation to unfold, he started to feel the weight of the moment. What was supposed to be a harmless joke now seemed like something far more serious. The idea of just walking away and pretending it hadn't happened crossed his mind. But something told him that might not be an option. The guard's stoic expression didn't change, but the atmosphere around them did. Chris shifted his weight, trying to act casual, but his nervous energy was now obvious. His friends exchanged looks, unsure whether to stay or leave. The awkwardness of the moment was beginning to sink in, but as Chris looked around, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. A police officer had appeared from nowhere and was walking straight toward him. The officer's serious face told him everything he needed to know. This was no longer a joke. The moment Chris saw the police officer walking toward him, a wave of panic washed over him. His heart started to race, and his mouth went dry. He had been so focused on the prank, so sure it would be a funny and harmless joke, that he hadn't considered the consequences. Now, standing there in front of the guard, the splashed coffee staining his uniform, Chris realized that things had escalated quickly. The officer approached him with steady, purposeful steps, his expression serious and unreadable. Chris froze. His mind went blank for a moment. He couldn't even think of what to say or how to explain himself. All he knew was that the officer wasn't smiling. There was no lightheartedness in his demeanor, no hint of humor in his gaze. It was clear that this was a matter that would not be taken lightly. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his voice firm but calm. "What do you think you're doing?" Chris opened his mouth, but no words came out. His friends, who had been standing a little farther back, were now inching closer, clearly nervous. They exchanged worried glances, not knowing how this would play out. One of them, Sarah, whispered, "Chris, what are you going to say?" Chris finally found his voice, but it didn't sound as confident as he had hoped. I didn't mean any harm. It was just a joke, just for fun. I thought it would be funny." The officer didn't seem moved by Chris' explanation. Instead, he looked down at the coffee stains on the guard's uniform and then back at Chris with a stern expression. "You've just thrown hot liquid on a royal guard. Do you understand how serious this is?" The words hit Chris like a punch to the gut. He hadn't even thought about it from that perspective. In his mind, it was just a simple prank. He hadn't realized the level of respect and authority that the guards held, not just for their ceremonial role, but as a symbol of the country's history and traditions. Chris had crossed a line, and he could feel it now, deep in his stomach. The officer continued, "You can't just treat people like this, especially not a royal guard. This is considered an offense, and you could be facing legal consequences for your actions." Chris' mind raced as he tried to grasp what was happening. He thought that maybe the officer would just give him a warning or let him go with a small fine, but this was clearly more serious than he had ever imagined. Chris tried to explain himself again, but his words felt weak and hollow. "I didn't think it would be a big deal. I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to offend anyone." But the officer wasn't convinced. He was calm, but his tone was firm, as if he had dealt with situations like this before. He asked Chris for his identification, which he handed over nervously. The officer took a moment to inspect it before looking back at Chris. "Come with me," the officer said, gesturing for Chris to follow. Chris' legs felt heavy as he walked, feeling the eyes of the surrounding tourists on him. He glanced over his shoulder, seeing his friends still standing there, unsure of what to do. They didn't know whether to follow or stay back. But Chris was too nervous to care about anything except what was about to happen. He followed the officer through the crowd, the weight of the situation sinking in with every step. Chris' mind was racing, filled with thoughts of how he had let his desire to be funny lead him down a path that he now couldn't escape. The lighthearted day of sightseeing had quickly turned into a nightmare. As Chris followed the officer, he couldn't help but feel the eyes of the crowd on him. The bustling city that had felt so lively and carefree earlier now seemed distant and cold. His mind was racing, and every step he took felt heavier than the last. He glanced around at the tourists, some of whom had stopped to watch the scene unfold, their phones raised to capture what had just happened. He could almost hear their whispers, the judgment in their eyes. It was all happening so fast, and Chris didn't know how to make it stop. The officer led him toward a nearby alley, away from the palace and the curious onlookers. The sound of footsteps echoed off the walls, and Chris felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had never been in trouble with the law before. In fact, he had always prided himself on being a law-abiding citizen, someone who followed the rules and avoided conflict. But now, as the officer ushered him toward a police car, everything seemed to be falling apart. "Please," Chris said, his voice shaky. "I'm really sorry. I didn't mean any harm. It was just a stupid prank." He tried to explain himself, but the officer didn't respond, his face as unreadable as ever. Chris wanted to tell him that he was just a tourist, far from home and not familiar with the local customs. But he knew deep down that wasn't an excuse. He had crossed a line, and now he had to face the consequences. The officer opened the door to the police car and motioned for Chris to get in. "You're not under arrest, but we need to take you in for questioning," the officer said, his tone still firm but not unkind. Chris nodded slowly, his heart sinking. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but he could tell that this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding that would be brushed off. As Chris sat in the back of the car, the gravity of the situation hit him full force. He thought about what his friends would say, how they would feel about everything that had happened. He could only imagine their disappointment. They had been so excited to explore the city with him, and now this stupid joke had turned their day upside down. The drive to the police station felt like an eternity. Chris couldn't stop replaying the moment in his mind. The way the coffee had splashed on the guard's uniform, the officer's stern expression, and the feeling of being caught in something he couldn't get out of. He had acted impulsively, not thinking about the consequences. It had seemed like a harmless joke, but now he could see just how wrong he had been. When they finally arrived at the station, Chris was led inside, his mind still reeling. The officer who had first approached him handed him over to a desk sergeant, who gave Chris a cold look before asking for his identification again. Chris handed it over, feeling like he was being treated like a criminal. The sergeant didn't say much, just typed something into the computer and motioned for Chris to wait. Chris sat down in a small, uncomfortable chair in the waiting area, his thoughts racing. He couldn't help but think about how his life had taken an unexpected turn in just a matter of hours. All of this had started with a simple prank, a moment of poor judgment, but now it was something much bigger. The seriousness of the situation was beginning to sink in. He had no idea what kind of punishment he might face, but he knew it wouldn't be as simple as a quick apology and walking away. Chris sat nervously in the waiting area of the police station, the minutes stretching on endlessly. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more chaotic than the last. He couldn't believe this was happening. One moment, he was laughing with his friends, excited to see the sights of the city. And the next, he was sitting in a cold, sterile room, waiting for someone to decide his fate. His stomach churned, and he couldn't help but replay the events that had led him here, over and over again. He kept telling himself it was just a mistake, that it wasn't meant to be a big deal. After all, he had just thrown some coffee on a guard, right? It wasn't like he had hurt anyone. But as the minutes passed, Chris realized how wrong he had been. The more he thought about it, the more he understood how serious the situation was. The Royal Guard wasn't just any person. He was a symbol of the country, part of a long-standing tradition, and Chris had disrespected that tradition in front of a crowd of tourists. He hadn't thought about the cultural significance of what he had done. It had seemed like a harmless joke at the time, but now he saw the weight of his actions. His friends were still outside, probably talking to each other, trying to figure out what to do next. Chris felt bad for them. They had only been following along, not realizing how serious the consequences might be. Chris had dragged them into this mess, and now it felt like he was the one responsible for ruining their trip. His mind flashed to his family back home. What would they say if they found out? He could already imagine the disappointment in their eyes. He had always prided himself on making good decisions, but this one had been a huge mistake. The sergeant who had taken his information earlier came over to him, his expression unreadable. He motioned for Chris to stand up. "Follow me," the sergeant said, his voice blunt and businesslike. Chris stood up slowly, his legs feeling shaky as he followed the officer down a narrow hallway. His mind was racing, but there was nothing he could do now except face whatever consequences awaited him. He felt like a kid who had just been caught doing something wrong, and there was no way to escape the situation. They reached a small room at the end of the hall, where another officer was sitting behind a desk. This officer looked up as Chris entered, his eyes scanning him briefly before he motioned for Chris to sit down. Chris obeyed, his nerves making it difficult to focus on anything else. The officer across from him started asking questions, his tone professional but stern. "What were you thinking?" the officer asked, flipping through some papers on his desk. "Why did you decide to throw the coffee?" Chris opened his mouth, but for a moment, no words came out. He had rehearsed an apology, but now, in the face of the officer's direct questions, he felt lost. He didn't have an answer that would make sense. "I thought it would be funny," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize it would cause this much trouble. I didn't think." The officer nodded, though his expression didn't soften. "This wasn't just a prank," he said firmly. "This is an act of disrespect to a person who represents the country's traditions. What you did has consequences. You need to understand that." Chris felt his chest tighten as the words sank in. He had thought it was just a joke, something harmless, but the officer was right. His actions had been more than just a silly mistake. They had been an insult, and now, it seemed like he would have to face the consequences of that. The officer continued asking questions, but Chris found it harder and harder to focus. His thoughts were a jumble of guilt, frustration, and embarrassment. He just wanted to go home, to escape the weight of what he had done. But he knew that wasn't an option. Not yet, anyway. He would have to stay in this small, uncomfortable room and wait, just like the rest of the day, waiting to see how it would all unfold. Chris sat quietly in the small room, his mind racing with thoughts that felt like a tangled mess. The officer across from him was still flipping through papers, occasionally glancing at Chris as if trying to gauge his reaction. Chris felt like a child who had done something wrong, not quite able to understand the full gravity of his actions until it was too late. He kept replaying the same question in his mind. How had something that started as a joke turned into this? As the minutes stretched on, Chris' anxiety grew. His throat felt dry, and he couldn't stop his legs from bouncing nervously under the table. Every sound in the room, from the rustle of the officer's papers to the hum of the air conditioning, felt amplified, making it impossible to focus on anything else. He wanted to explain himself better, to tell the officer that he never meant for any of this to happen, but the words stuck in his throat. After what felt like an eternity, the officer finally looked up at Chris. "You understand why this is a problem, don't you?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Chris nodded slowly, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. "Yes," he said quietly. "I understand now. I didn't think it through. It was just a stupid prank, and I didn't realize how serious it was." The officer seemed to study him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Chris felt like he was being examined under a microscope. "Pranks can go wrong," the officer said, "but this isn't something that can be easily brushed off. There are consequences for disrespecting authority, especially when it involves a figure as important as a royal guard." Chris wanted to argue, to say that he didn't mean any harm, that he wasn't trying to hurt anyone or cause trouble. But the officer's words were sinking in, and Chris could no longer deny the seriousness of what he had done. He had disrespected the guard, yes, but more than that, he had disrespected the people and the country he was visiting. He had taken something that should have been a moment of respect and turned it into a joke. And now he was paying the price. The officer continued, "You've caused a disruption, not just for the guard, but for the people around you. People saw what happened, and now they're going to talk about it. This isn't something that can just be ignored." Chris hung his head, the guilt weighing him down. He could see the scene in his mind, the way the coffee had splashed onto the guard's uniform, and how the people around them had reacted. He hadn't considered the impact his actions might have on the other tourists, on the people who looked up to the guards as symbols of the country's traditions. It hadn't been just about the guard, it was about something much bigger. The officer's next words were not as harsh as Chris expected. "I'm not going to arrest you," the officer said, his tone softening slightly. "But you're going to have to pay a fine for your actions. You'll be required to make a formal apology, and will also need to report this to the local authorities back home." Chris' heart skipped a beat at the mention of a fine. He had hoped this would all blow over, but it was clear now that there would be consequences. "How much is the fine?" he asked quietly, already dreading the answer. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the paperwork in front of him before looking back at Chris. "We'll let you know," he said simply. Chris nodded, feeling the weight of his actions and the uncertainty of what would happen next. He had learned a valuable lesson, but it was a hard one to swallow. The thought of facing a fine, not to mention the embarrassment of explaining everything to his friends and family, made him feel small. But more than that, he realized that sometimes even the smallest actions could have consequences that you couldn't predict. As the officer stood up and motioned for him to follow, Chris felt a strange mix of relief and dread. He was getting out of the room, but he knew that the repercussions of his mistake were far from over. Chris followed the officer out of the room, his steps slower now, as though each one was carrying more weight than the last. He had spent what felt like hours in that small, sterile space, reflecting on what had happened and how his harmless prank had spiraled into something so much more serious. The officer led him back through the hallway, past the desk sergeant, who now gave Chris a disapproving glance as he passed. The tension in the air seemed to thicken with every step, and Chris couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Outside, his friends were waiting, looking as nervous and confused as he felt. They had been standing around, talking quietly among themselves, but the moment they saw Chris, their faces immediately filled with concern. Sarah, who had been the most vocal about his prank earlier, looked especially worried. She was the first to approach him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Chris, what happened? Are you okay?" Chris gave a small, tired nod. "I'm fine, but it's not over yet. They're making me pay a fine for what happened, and I'll need to make an official apology." His friends were quiet for a moment, trying to process the seriousness of what he was saying. They had all been caught up in the fun of the moment, but now they were seeing how much trouble Chris had gotten into. Sarah's face softened with concern. "I can't believe this is happening. We didn't know it would get so serious." Chris sighed, feeling the weight of his mistake more than ever. "Neither did I. It was just supposed to be a silly joke. But now it's a lot bigger than that." The officer who had been escorting Chris stepped forward, handing him a small envelope. "This is the formal notice of the fine," the officer explained, his tone still professional, but less stern than before. "You'll need to take care of this before you leave the country. And don't forget that you'll also have to submit a formal apology to the Royal Guards unit. That's part of the process." Chris took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. The reality of what he had done was settling in more heavily now. He had never imagined that something so small could have such a big impact. His friends stood by him in silence, not quite sure what to say, but Chris could see the concern in their eyes. He knew they were worried about him, but more than that, they were disappointed. Not in him as a person, but in the fact that he hadn't thought ahead before acting. "Thanks," Chris muttered to the officer, not sure if he was thanking him for the information or for letting him go with just a fine and not an arrest. The officer gave him a nod and turned to leave, disappearing into the station as quickly as he had appeared. For a few moments, the group stood there in uncomfortable silence. Chris felt like all eyes were on him, and he couldn't help but feel embarrassed. He had ruined what was supposed to be a fun, carefree day, and now they would all have to face the consequences. But deep down, he knew this was a lesson he would never forget. "I'm so sorry, guys," Chris said, his voice sincere. I should have thought this through better. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Sarah gave him a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's not your fault, Chris. We all got caught up in the moment. But we'll figure it out. We'll make sure you get through this." The rest of the group nodded in agreement, offering their support, but Chris could tell that the lighthearted atmosphere they had once shared was gone. The reality of the situation had settled in, and it wasn't something they could just shake off. As they walked out of the police station, Chris felt a strange mix of emotions: relief that it was over, frustration at how easily everything had gone wrong, and guilt for dragging his friends into this mess. But more than anything, he felt the weight of the lesson he had learned. Sometimes, even the smallest actions could have the biggest consequences, and while he couldn't undo what had happened, he could only hope that, in the future, he would think twice before turning something serious into a joke. As they made their way back to the hotel, the group was quiet, each person processing the events in their own way. Chris knew that it might take some time before things felt normal again. But for now, he was just thankful it was over, and that he had learned something valuable, even if it had come at a heavy price.